to work against the Germans, who employed all available aircraft for the assault. Novikov stressed hit-and-run ambush tactics against the Luftwaffe, who flew thousands of sorties. Ironically, the attacks by Hitler's Air Force served as on-the-job training for Soviet pilots. As more fighters were delivered to the front, the more adept they became at countering German tactics. Novikov's strategy was beginning to work. More and more transport aircraft were needed to resupply Nazi forces trapped inside Stalingrad. As the Soviet air defense ring tightened, Ju-52s were forced to run the gauntlet. The Russians presumed from the start that the Germans would have to airlift supplies to their troops. The Air Force drew a series of concentric rings around the German forces on the map. These designated areas became aerial blockades of fighter planes and curtains of anti-aircraft fire. If the Luftwaffe had had enough transports, they might have been able to supply the beleaguered Sixth Army force entombed inside the destroyed city. But the Germans didn't have all the planes they needed. They assembled a ragtag collection of planes that were forced to operate under increasing bad weather conditions. The Russian Air Force grew increasingly aggressive, harassing the long lines of transports despite their fighter protection. Soviet fighters attacked German airfields. One of the more unusual victories was scored by Soviet pilot Starsky Sergeant I.M. Chumbarev. He downed this Junkers 88 bomber by using the Taran, or ramming maneuver, during the air battle. But men weren't the only heroes in the sky at Stalingrad. The pilots of the famous all-women 586th Fighter Regiment began a long series of battle honors in intense aerial combat. Germany suffered a humiliating defeat when the decimated Sixth Army was forced to surrender. Hitler realized he now held a wolf by the ears. He ordered his retreating forces to undertake one last offensive. The target was Kursk, where Soviet troops occupied a bulge in the German lines, 450 kilometers south of Moscow. The attack was delayed for bad weather, and then because Hitler wanted to wait for delivery of his new Panther tanks. Meanwhile, a spy tipped off the Russians. As a result, they were able to prepare a defense in depth. The Soviet Air Force had more than 2,900 planes, more than 1,000 fighters, and 940 Ilyushin Sturmovik tank busters. The Germans massed more than 2,000 aircraft for the offensive. Because of demands in other fronts, they could only muster 600 fighter planes. At first, the advantage went to the Luftwaffe pilots, but soon the lack of fighter aircraft began to tell. The German planes could not break through the screen of escorting Yak-9s and La-5s to stop the marauding Sturmoviks. After a huge struggle, Hitler called off the offensive. The days of glory were over for Germany and just beginning for Russia. On the Eastern Front, the Luftwaffe suffered, but in the West, it got a boost in the form of the Messerschmitt Me-262, the greatest fighter of the war. Its jet power would be the future of high-performance aircraft. During the final months of the war, advancing Soviet troops captured German jet technology, developed at enormous cost and resources. The wartime fighters built by Artyom Mikoyan and Mikhail Gurevich had not been preeminent. Still, their MiG design bureau assumed the challenge of bringing the jet age to Russia. They knew from tests that conventional wing designs would not be suitable for jet power. The MiG team set up a low-speed swept wing design study and built a strange aeroplane called the Utka, or Duck, which served as a flying testbed. With a few modifications, the Utka became a valuable research tool. It was from these humble beginnings that MiG, would become the most famous aircraft manufacturing organization in the world. In 1945, Stalin ordered a crash program to build fighters using captured German turbojets, as there were no suitable Soviet jet engines. When the MiG I-300 fighter prototype flew for the first time in 1946, it was powered by a German BMW engine. The production version was called the MiG-9. 550 were built between 1946 and 1948. They were powerfully armed with one 37mm cannon and two 23mm cannons. Already the Cold War was beginning. Known by the NATO codename Fargo, the MiG-9 was the first Soviet fighter equipped with an ejection seat. The MiG-9 was a great achievement for Artyom Mikoyan. He was awarded the Stalin Prize, but the stress of the project led to a heart attack. Mikoyan had competitors, and one of them was Alexander Yakovlev, the famous wartime fighter designer. Yakovlev decided that the new aircraft would use components of the Yak-9 piston engine fighter to the greatest possible extent. The engine was mounted underneath the fuselage, and the tail was strengthened to protect it from hot exhaust gases. When the Yak-17 appeared, it featured a tricycle landing gear with the nose wheel housed in a bulge under the forward fuselage. Stalin was pleased with the jet fighters, and this established Alexander Yakovlev as one of the leading post-war designers. Along with Mikoyan and Gurevich, he was now at the top of Soviet design pecking order. In 1946, Artyom Mikoyan got a big break in the Cold War race to develop the greatest jet fighter. Along with the engine designer Vladimir Klimov, he visited Rolls-Royce in England. There, he learned that the acquisition of a small number of Nene and Derwent jet engines by the Soviet Union was likely. Mikoyan and Klimov quickly returned home and reconfigured their airframe and power plant proposals to meet the Nene specifications. When the engines were shipped to Russia, they were copied, and soon Nene 2s and Derwent 5s were rolling down the assembly lines, now known as Soviet RD-45s and RD-500s. The new aircraft differed greatly from the MiG-9. It featured a tubular fuselage with the engine mounted inside. The jet engine exhaust nozzle was at the rear of the tube, so those gases didn't come into contact with the fuselage. The heavy-duty landing gear folded into the wing, and the aircraft's skin was constructed of aluminium. On the 30th of December 1948, Viktor Yuganov flew the first production MiG-15 aircraft. It had outstanding performance. Production began in several satellite countries. The new fighters were delivered to Soviet air defense forces in January 1949. Like most Soviet fighters, toughness was the major characteristic of the MiG-15. It could withstand rough treatment without breaking. Improvements and modifications were incorporated into the aircraft as they were manufactured, and there were wide variations in quality and performance. The MiG-15 could fly 290 kilometers without external tanks. While it was not normal practice, some MiG-5As were equipped with aerial refueling capability. They were fed by Tu-4 tankers, which were modified copies of the Boeing B-29. In June 1950, Communist North Korean forces attacked South Korea with great speed and violence. Lightly armed South Korean and US Army troops took the brunt of the lightning offensive. While US forces managed to hold a perimeter